Hello. The video that follows completes automated transfer of credit card category expenses in the Power Query Excel checkbook. It demonstrates the utilization of one Power Query as a source of another and shows Visual Basic for Applications code references to Excel tables and columns, as well as examples of object variables, if statements, message boxes, and with blocks. I hope you'll find it useful.
This is the fourth video in the Excel Power Query checkbook series. It completes automated categorization of credit card expenses and demonstrates the transfer of those expenses to the transactions worksheet. Before we move to the payment tables, we have one edit to make on the CC2 trans table because we've added row totals, and particularly since here we're obtaining our data from a table and not the query. When we add the row total, when the CC2 trans grabs this data, it'll show the total row, and we want to eliminate that from the query. So let's go ahead and edit the query. We can see it over here. And we can see the total row is down on the bottom. Removing it is pretty easy since there's some null entries. And since there's no reason we'd ever want to do any math on the trans type column, all we have to do is go to the drop down arrow and remove empties. And that will get rid of a total row, and if the total row isn't there, it won't hurt us any. So let's rename that last step. Remove total row. Okay, that's it. And we can go ahead and close and load. And now let's move on to the payment tables. We'll begin with the CC2 report. So let's go ahead and get data from other sources. Start with a blank query. And at the very beginning, we will get the CC2 report. And that's how we'll start ourselves off. So that's going to be our source data. And now all we have to do is grab whatever payments we've made. We're showing the payments because we may not have only one payment made for the credit card. And this will tell us if we have multiple payments. Anyway, all we have to do is go back to the payments column and just remove empties again. And that brings us to our payment rows, and in this case we only have one payment from the previous credit card statement. I'm going to rename the step. Isolate payments. And we don't need both amount and payments, so we'll just get rid of the amount column. Keep the payments column. Home, remove column. Rename the step. And we can go ahead and close and load two. I'm going to get a table. It's going to be an existing table. We're not going to put it on J2. We're going to go to column O. So let's go to O2. And click OK. And here we are with our payments. Going to make that green. Let's put payments up top here. So we can see all the payments we've made on the last credit card statement. And we have one more payment table. That's the next payments. Before we do that, let's go ahead and make this accounting format. Move this over a little bit. And here will be our next payment table. And we'll complete this data when we've gone ahead and arranged for payment of the current credit card statement. So we'll have 3 columns. The first will be card, and that will be the card designation, the name, then the date we're going to make the payment, and finally the pay ID. So in this case, we're at credit card 2. We're going to call this credit card 2. The date is going to be September 3rd, and the pay ID, we'll just call it CC2. Okay, and that, of course, is the confirmation after you've arranged to make that payment. So this now becomes a table. Let's format it as a table. It has headers. And we need to name it. And we're going to name this one CC2 Next Pay. Okay. We should also rename our payment query here because the designation right now is query 1, so I'm going to right click, edit it, and just use the CC2 underscore pay name here. And close and load. We're about ready to transfer our expenses to the transaction sheet. And our table here, the CC2 trans table, is configured so it will fit into appropriate columns in the transaction sheet. Let's go ahead and look at the transaction sheet over here. So the memo category type and amount, that is where our credit card expenses is going to fit. But we also have to put in the date, the pay ID, and the description, and they are in our last table, our CC2 Next Pay table. And unfortunately, because we want to keep the calculations in this sheet, we can't just use a Power Query append because we'd lose the calculations. What we want to do here is use a macro, an Excel macro program to go ahead and make that transfer. So the steps to take with the macro are: 1, ensure the next payment date and confirmation ID are ready for transfer. 2, enter the date, confirmation ID, and credit card name in a 3-component array. 3, determine the number of rows to be added to the transactions table to accept credit card expenses. 4, identify the uppermost transaction table row that will hold the transferred data. 5, add appropriate rows to the transaction table. 6, enter date, confirmation ID, and credit card name in the transaction table through the array. And 7, copy and paste credit card expenses from the CC2 trans table into the transaction table. So let's start in the Visual Basic Editor. Developer tab, Visual Basic. Let's insert a module. And we're going to call this module CC Transfer. All right. Now, I'm going to add some code here, which I'm going to try to explain as I move along. I'm going to start with dimension statements and the comments, and they're going here. Our subroutine is called transfer CC for transfer credit card, and let's see if we can take this step by step as we move through the system here. The first is to explain the macro purpose and create message text strings. So let's go ahead and put those in. We can see that we've designated them as CCM, and they're strings, so they're in quotes, and the program obtains its next payment date and next payment confirmation number from the next payment table. And it asks the user to ensure that the user's in the correct credit card worksheet. And the reason for being in the correct credit card worksheet is that this macro will be used for every credit card and each credit card has its own worksheet. Our demo is CC2. So it asks the user if everything is ready. Confirmation that everything is ready is done through an input box. So if we can put that in. So there's a variable that accepts the output of the input box so the user can confirm that things are ready. So there's a title here. It's a date confirmation check. There's an if statement. If the user says it's not ready, then a message box shows, and it says it's exiting the macro, and then it will leave the subroutine. And of course we need an end if on that. The next part of the macro connects the credit cards with their appropriate tables. Because we only have CC2 in this case, there really isn't a need for the if statement, but when we have multiple credit cards, then we're going to want to have different names depending on the worksheet name. In this case, we're in the worksheet CC2, and these are the credit card to appropriate tables. If we're in CC1 or CC3, then they would have different table names. We get the data for the first three columns of the transaction table from our next pay table, and we're putting that into an array. I'm showing the array as two-dimension, even though I probably could have just done it with one. But the index number starts at 0, so the third dimension of the array is the credit card name. So we get that from the card column, and data body range being 1, which would be the first element. It turns out there's only one element in there. But that takes us to the card column and the entry, which is the card name. Then the first element of the array will be the date, because that'll be first in our sequence. The date comes first in the transaction table. That's from the date column, excuse me. And then finally the second element, which is from the pay ID column, will be the ID, and they all go into the CC array. Then we have one more check with the user to make sure we're transferring the correct data. And we have some strings, we have a message box to make the check, and we have an if statement that exits the subroutine if the user is not confident the right data is being transferred. We create some variables for worksheets and tables. Now we count the number of rows we need in the transaction table, and that just happens to be the number of rows in the data body range of the next pay table. So that's what the VRows variable stores. The row in the transaction worksheet that will hold the first of the credit card payments is the row where the totals are before the macro begins. So we add the correct number of rows with a for next loop by adding rows from 1 to the number of rows that are in the transfer table. Now we put locations in variables for the two data blocks from the credit card payments. So we need to go to the transaction worksheet. So RNG will give us the location for the date and the pay ID and the credit card name, and RNG1 will be the location for the data that's in our CC Trans table for credit card payments. And we need an end with for that. Get the proper indents here. We put the array values into the transaction table simply by making RNG equal to the array. And we copy paste into RNG1 to get the credit card expenses. The last step just ensures that we match the font and the size that's in the transaction table. Forgot to add an important step here. We can see that when we're checking, we're seeing if the WS1 variable name is CC2, but there's no place that I've entered WS1. So just before we're confirming the data is ready, right there, let's go ahead and set WS1 to the active sheet in the workbook. That will require that the user be on the correct credit card worksheet when they attempt to make the transfer. And there's one more correction, and that is changing the CCN to CC because we want the card name 0,2. And that should take care of that. Okay, let's try the macro. We have to be in the CC2 worksheet, which we are. And let's go to macros, run. The program obtains its next payment date. Yes, they're ready. Transaction credit card 2 will transfer. Yes. And let's go over to the transaction sheet and we can see that the new credit card expenses are there. The balance is already calculated from the equations that were in the balance column already, and we have made the transfer.